Okay, hi, I'm Steve Threadgold from the University of Newcastle, Australia, and welcome to the Social Science Week seminar that we're doing at the moment, Doctors with a Difference, Social Science Insights on Widening Participation in Medicine, Australian, Canadian and UK perspectives. It's quite a mouthful. I'm actually in Manchester today, so while I'm kind of on the land of the colonisers, I still want to acknowledge where the event has been organised and where some of the participants are coming from, which is Newcastle. So I want to acknowledge and respect the Pamelong clan of the Wabakal people, the traditional custodians of the land there, and acknowledge traditional custodians on the land of where everyone's joining us from today. Today, we're going to be talking about some projects, some rare projects that are 10 years in the making, really, about medical students, first in family students, often taking on medical careers. Just broadly, it's part of Social Science Week, which is a really important week for the social sciences in Australia. That University of Newcastle enthusiastically takes part of in every year. So it's really great to be part of that again. And we're joined today by Cara Brosnan, who's Associate Professor of Sociology in the School of Humanities, Creative Industries and Social Sciences at the University of Newcastle. Jia Liu is a lecturer in clinical communication in the School of Medical Education at King's College in London. Sarah Wright, a research scientist at the Michael Garron Hospital and Assistant Professor, Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Toronto. And Dr. Parker McGinn, who's a GP and Senior Manager of GP Training and Research Department at the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, as well as being a conjoint professor in the School of Medicine and Public Health at the University of Newcastle. So we have a little bit to get through. Cara's going to start us off by introducing us to the broad topic area and the work that's been going on, and then we'll hear from our other speakers. So thanks, Cara. Do you want to start?
Sure, great. Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks everyone for coming. I'd also just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from a Wabakal and Worimi country and pay my respects to traditional owners and elders past, present and future. So as Steve said, this seminar is really the culmination of 10 years of work that our team has been doing on the experiences of medical students who come from low socioeconomic or first and family backgrounds. So first and family meaning that their parents haven't been to university. And between us, we've done this work in Australia, the UK and Canada, but we've never really brought this work together. So that's what we're aiming to do tonight. So the central problem that all of our research addresses is the underrepresentation of people from first and family or low SES or working class backgrounds in medical school and the medical profession. So in the West, medicine has historically been an elite profession that has included mostly white men from privileged backgrounds. So over the past few years, medicine has become more diverse, but many inequalities remain. And lack of representation in medicine is problematic for two main reasons. So the first is that the exclusiveness of medical degrees and medical careers is a form of inequity in itself. So it's meant that becoming part of one of the most highly paid, powerful, prestigious professions has been largely out of reach for some sectors of the community. So this has impeded social mobility, social change, and it's an issue of social justice. And then the second relates to inequities in healthcare access. So being a fairly privileged and homogenous group, doctors have been socially and culturally distant from many of their patients. And this distance can make doctor-patient communication less smooth, introduce bias, reduce the doctor's understanding of the context of the patient's health concerns, and make healthcare less culturally safe. And this is especially important to address because the groups that are underrepresented in the medical profession are also the groups experiencing the poorest health outcomes due to the social determinants of health. So it's hoped that by diversifying the medical profession, healthcare itself will actually improve. And research is just really emerging to show that for some underrepresented groups in medicine, mortality and morbidity are actually decreased when there's concordance between the gender or the ethnicity of the doctor and the patient. Or to put it bluntly, some studies are showing that particular groups of patients are less likely to die when treated by a doctor who is more like them. So while the gender and ethnic balance of the medical profession has been gradually changing, the class or socioeconomic background of medical students and doctors does remain quite strongly skewed towards the middle and upper classes. So only around 10% of Australian medical students are from low SES backgrounds. It's similar in the UK. One UK study found that 80% of applicants for medicine came from just 20% of UK secondary schools, with private schools being very overrepresented. So research has looked into the reasons why and found that, firstly, high school students from low SES backgrounds, low socioeconomic backgrounds, are much less likely to aspire to go to medical school in the first place. So these students have often had little exposure to medical or health professionals beyond their own doctor or what they've seen on TV. And this shapes their own view of their future. So medicine is not often even thought of as an option. Students from low SES backgrounds who are interested in a medical career often underestimate their chances of actually getting into medical school and believe it's a place just for rich people, not people like them, so they can be put off applying. And those who do decide to go ahead and apply to medicine often have to navigate this really quite involved and costly process with limited guidance from teachers or parents. So based on these understandings, quite a lot of work over the last 20 years or so has gone into what's often called widening participation in medicine. And this involves medical schools critically reviewing their admissions processes, improving outreach in high schools, and creating new pathways to make entry more accessible to disadvantaged students. And the success of these widening participation projects has largely been measured by whether medical schools get more applications from disadvantaged students and admit more students from, for example, low SES backgrounds. What hasn't been well understood, or at least it hadn't been 10 years ago when we started this work, is what it's like for students from low SES or first and family backgrounds who do actually go on to medical school. So what are their experiences? Are there any barriers or inequities that persist within medical school and beyond? What kind of doctors do these students hope to be? What kind of doctors do they become? And how does this journey into the profession affect their identity and relationships and the way they practice medicine? So as we see it, to really understand the impact and the success of widening participation, we need to look beyond the point of admission to medical school and follow diverse groups of students in their journeys through medical school and into the profession. So that's what we've tried to do. And I'll dive in now to the first in the suite of studies that we've conducted trying to answer some of these questions. So back in 2014, we set out to study the experiences of Australian medical students who were first in family, meaning their parents hadn't been to university. And we used the category first in family, which is widely used in education research because it overlaps strongly with working class or low socioeconomic status backgrounds, but it's also an objective category, which meant we could recruit participants without depending on whether they self-identified as coming from a particular class background. And we were then able to sort of explore class identity as part of the research. First and family also doesn't overlap entirely, of course, with class or SES. So a few of our participants were from higher SES backgrounds, but they were still unfamiliar with the culture of higher education. So in order to understand students' experiences, we chose a qualitative methodology and conducted in-depth interviews with students. And interviews are a widely used method in social sciences for anyone who's not familiar with that. So 22 students volunteered for the study across 5 year levels of one medical school. And most of them did come from relatively low SES backgrounds. So 3/4 of our participants grew up in areas that fell in the more disadvantaged 50% of suburbs. For more than half of our participants, neither of their parents had completed high school, and the parents were mostly in low status occupations. So our interviews focused on students' experiences of deciding to study medicine, applying to and starting medical school, how they felt about fitting into medicine, and what kind of doctors they aspired to be. And our overall findings, which we published in 2016, were that our first and family students did continue to experience some inequality within medical school. So some of this related to finances and the cost of studying medicine, other inequalities related to social positioning. So to interpret our data, we drew on a framework developed by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. So Bourdieu's work shows that how people's preferences, aspirations, and their perceptions of what is possible for them are strongly shaped by socialization and where their family is positioned in the social structure. So he calls this the habitus. And the habitus is deeply ingrained. It's a set of dispositions that guides our choices and our actions over our lifetime, although it can possibly adapt, especially through other socialization processes that occur later on, including going through a sort of professional socialization process like becoming a doctor. What kind of habitus we have is also related to what kinds of resources or capital we can access. And this doesn't just refer to economic capital or money, but also social and cultural resources. And these different types of capital are interrelated. So someone who grew up with a lot of economic advantage is going to have access to other forms of capital that are associated with prestige, status, and power. And the reverse is true too. And institutions that have been the domain of more privileged people, like medical schools, tend to value and reproduce the most prestigious forms of capital. So each of our studies has applied these concepts and looking particularly at the kinds of capital that different groups of students have and bring. So I'm just going to touch on a few findings from the Australian study from 2014, running through the three main types of capital that we looked at. So I'll start with social capital, which is who you know. This is the capital that comes through relationships and belonging to networks. And previous studies show that having doctors in your social network can help medical school applicants to understand what medical schools are looking for, help people get the sort of work experience that looks good on an application. And first and family students are less likely to be part of these networks. But our study found that social capital continued to be relevant even after first and family students had started medical school. So as Zoe says here, not knowing anyone who had been to university made the experience much more daunting. And many participants felt that they had less confidence than some of the other medical students, particularly students whose parents were doctors. And they also believed that they had less access to clinical placement options as a student and less knowledge of the medical career structure compared to other students. So Zoe said everyone seemed a lot more confident. They'd planned to do medicine since they'd entered high school. A lot of people had parents or family members who were doctors. So I really had no idea. So our participants felt less embedded in medical social networks than their peers seemed to be. And financial constraints or having less economic capital also contributed to their ability to become embedded in these social networks and to socialize with wealthier students. So social and economic capital were intertwined. So another student, Tanya, said at the time, I still don't fit into that scene, meaning with other medical students. I don't have the money to sort of throw around like they do. They'll go to expensive restaurants and things. Well, I just can't afford it. And financial worries were quite common among our interviewees. So a small number of students reported at the time quite serious financial difficulties. And they were often reluctant to ask for help or didn't know where to ask for help. So Kate said, I hate being in debt to people. I don't like borrowing money. My nan rings up sometimes and says, do you need $20? And I'm like, no, nan, it's fine. Like, I'd rather just not eat for the day or something. So some of our participants were experiencing financial stress at the time and were also worried about whether they would be able to afford to go out on clinical placements that were a compulsory part of the degree. And then another key form of capital is cultural capital. So this is what you know, having the right kind of knowledge, knowing how to behave in particular social settings. And we found that quite a few students were experiencing a tension between their old selves and the rules of behavior in the socio-cultural environment that they had grown up in, compared to their new identity as a trainee doctor. So, for example, a few actually said that they were stigmatized in their home communities just for going to university, let alone doing an elite degree like medicine. And they weren't sure whether they were going to fit into the medical profession in future. So Samantha imagined that as a doctor, she would be able to be herself with patients, but she said, I don't know how I'm expected to behave around other doctors. So I might have to be a slightly more refined version of myself as a doctor. And this idea of being able to identify with patients maybe more than with other doctors was a strong theme across the interviews. Participants saw this as a strength, actually, that they would bring to practice. So another student, Nick, believed that growing up with what he described as a very humble background meant that he would be able to relate well to patients and understand their circumstances. So he said, I understand where they're coming from. I understand why it might be a health disaster because there's the cigarettes and there's the Centrelink benefits, which don't pay very much. And I've just lost my job because the mine closed. However, some of the knowledge and skills that our first and family students felt they had weren't necessarily recognised in medical school. So one student, Fiona, told us how a lecturer had presented a case of social disadvantage in class and assumed that medical students wouldn't be able to relate to it. So she said, the lecturer told the story of this little boy who was growing up and his mother was a heroin addict and he ended up in jail. And the lecturer was like, see, so you're all privileged and you don't know these kinds of people. And I'm like, I was that little boy, but okay. Then it sparked quite a lot of conversation in the tutorial and everyone was like, we're never going to meet these people. I didn't say anything. I bit my tongue. So our participants didn't really share their different perspectives with their peers in medical school, even though these were the things that they thought would make them good doctors. So at the time we interviewed our participants in 2014, they were really still making sense of their place in the medical profession and working out how to navigate potential advantages and disadvantages that they experienced. So I'm going to pick up later tonight on some of these findings around cultural capital when I come to our follow-up study that we've done this year. But I'm going to stop now and hand over to Jar, who's going to talk about some findings from the UK study.
Thank you very much, Karak. Shall I share my screen with everyone? Just want to check if everyone can see my screen all right? Okay, thank you. So good morning, everyone from London. I'm Jia, I'm from King's College London, and today I'm going to present the research titled Understanding the Experience of Medical Students Who Are First in Family to Attend University, an English Perspective from One Medical School, on behalf of my co-authors, Dr. Andrew Bassett and Professor Heidi Lamb. So before I get started, just want to mention that I was not directly involved in this project, which was conducted about 9 years ago. So today my plan is really to present an overview and try to answer as questions as I can. So thank you very much, Karak, for setting the scene really nicely about this international collaborative project and explaining Bourdieu theory really clearly. That's a very difficult job to do in my view. So for the study in the UK one, we also guided by theories of Bourdieu and the classicism and framework. And the purpose really first is try to explore the transition into medical school for first in family medical students. So focusing on the experiences, the pre-entry transition. And then also to understand first in family students' experiences of undergraduate medical education, so the period of in medical school transition, and also to examine the aspirations of first in family medical students after degree completion, so the prospective post-graduation transition. So due to time limitation, I'm not going to cover all the details about the project, but there are 2 papers just want to mention are published based on this project. So if anyone's interested, feel free to have a look. So as Karak has mentioned, so this UK study followed pretty much a very similar approach with Australian study. So methodology-wise, we used a qualitative and also interpretive approach. Altogether, 20 first-in family students were recruited from a traditional 5-year program and also 6-year program, which I will explain from one medical school in the UK, which is King's College London. So semi-structured interviews were conducted between 2016 to 2017, and we used the same interview schedule with Australian study, also Canadian study. So the data were analyzed thematically by using NVivo. So these slides give a bit of an overview about the student specific background. So we can see as for the, in terms of the 20 participants, 12 of them are female, 8 of them are male students, and the majority of them are from ethnic minority backgrounds. And we can also see from the parental occupation, all of the students with the families are from a working class background. Okay, so these are the demographic background of the 20 participants. So in the next few slides, I'm going to give an overview of the results, also following Bourdieu's theoretical framework. I'm going to start with social capital. So the results of this research has highlighted the centrality of a medically relevant work experience in the application process and the role of social capital in assessing it. So in this research, participants has mentioned that work experience is really important for them to get into medical school. And also a lot of them have experienced organizational bureaucratic issues that delayed the prevented access. So the barriers existed in assessing working experience, which made some medical students have to take a gap year just to get the experience. And applicants from Medicaid family backgrounds. So that's quite similar with Carol when she presented in the Australian study. So these participants with families with been practicing medicine were seen to have distinct advantages. So on the right side, I presented a data. One of the first family students mentioned that they have to take a gap year just to prepare for the medical school application. And then economic capital. So the results show that the lack of economic capital prevented the maximization of learning opportunities at med school and also raised issue of student retention. So most participants in this research had to combine paid work alongside with a degree. So this lack of economic capital, so having to work really impacted their academic learning and so deprived lots of opportunities. So this raised the issue of student retention. For example, on the right side of the slide, one first-in family students mentioned that they felt really physically, emotionally, and also mentally exhausted while having to pursue a very demanding degree such as medicine. And then culture capital. So students mentioned the prospect of becoming a doctor and also the accumulation of culture capital were embraced. But some students held out, especially with the junior doctor contract in 2016 and also the tenuous NHS pathways. So for those who are not most familiar with the 2016 junior doctor contract in the UK, so basically this contract resulted in changes to pay and working hours with a focus on safeguarding, but this is at the cost of reduced overtime pay and also weekend enhancements, which led to extensive protests and strikes. So in this research, quite a few students mentioned that becoming a doctor will elevate their social status, but some of them are not a bit uncertain about this. So quite a few participants mentioned the possibility of leaving medicine after graduation, and some perceived the conditions to practice would be more favorable abroad rather than in the UK. So on the right side is data showing that the one students mentioned they probably not practicing medicine after the degree. So classism. So some participants in the research have shared the experience mentioning that when about preparing to apply for medical school, they will not encourage their previous school teachers, being saying that they do not have the required intellectual capacity to do so. So these participants have to refer to their determination to resolve to get into medical school and prove the teachers' doubts were unjustified. And some participants felt out of place around other medical students from traditional middle class or more traditional university backgrounds, and a few experienced othering or boundary marking from other students. So data on the right sort of kind of reflect the themes students feel a lack of less belonging in medical school compared to students from more traditional middle class backgrounds. So comparing the UK study to Australian study and Canadian study, I want to say that the findings are strikingly similar across the three studies. However, there were few differences. For example, one of the differences about the varied focus of cultural groups due to distinct contexts. So in the UK, the class is a very socially relevant term. So over the study, we can see that all of the participants are from a working class family backgrounds, with all of them having low social economic status. So this is slightly different from a few of the participants in Australian and also Canadian studies. And also the recruitment channels. So for the UK study, so two channels we have used for participant recruitment. So one is a traditional 5-year MBBS program within King's. The other is an extended 6-year EMDP program, so which is a widening participation program that Karak has explained, to basically try to support students from underrepresented backgrounds to go to medicine. So lots of participants with the EMDP are from first-in-family backgrounds. That kind of explains why the majority of the participants are recruited via the EMDP program. We also find that in the UK study, even though financial struggle was a kind of a theme that shared across the 3 countries, but this is a very prominent theme in the UK study. So a significant number of students in this project had to work, live with families, or having caring responsibilities. And this is probably because the study was conducted in London, where the cost of living is really high. So financial struggle was becoming a very prominent theme for this study. So that's kind of a very brief overview of the UK study. And lastly, before finish, just want to use 1 minute to quickly kind of update how things may have changed in the past decade. So short answer is that things have not changed significantly in the past decade, but there has been a few changes. For example, in the UK, across medical schools, there is a growing trend of a decolonization of the medical curriculum. So re-evaluating content to be more inclusive, addressing biases, and also better reflecting the diverse patient needs especially after the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. So lots of the decolonization programs are started by students or co-created with medical students. And also within the NHS, there's a growing need for doctors due to the higher healthcare demands. So this is again exacerbated by financial constraints and also workforce shortages. And so the junior doc strikes continue to be the case since 2016, with ongoing strikes over pay increases and also improved working conditions, citing pay erosion and also unsustainable workloads. And then widening participant programs across medical schools in the UK, for example, in the King's, try to support and also support and have initiatives that are offering student support, for example, including confidence building workshops and also safe reporting forums with senior academics to allow first-in-family students and the students from other represented backgrounds to gain more support that they need. However, with the support provided, student experience still feel that support is not sufficient and underrepresented students continue to feel less included. And this can be evidenced from the results of the National Student Survey and also a very recent research project we just completed comparing students' attainment between mainstream students and also underrepresented backgrounds. So that's about how things have changed. And lastly, just want to briefly mention that our next steps, which Karak will talk about later in the follow-up study in Australia. So in the UK, we also plan to do a follow-up study to re-interview the participants we have interviewed about 8 or 9 years ago and to see how the experiences are now and also how first-in-family backgrounds have influenced and also played the role in the current medical practice. So lastly is the reference, and also thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Shah. Now Sarah is going to talk about the Canadian aspect. I'll get you to stop sharing there, Shah, and Sarah can share her screen.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. I'll attempt to share my screen.
Can you stop sharing yours, please, Shah? Yeah, there we go. Yep.
There we go. Share. Does that look right, everyone? Okay. Thank you. So I'm coming to you from Toronto this morning. It's 6:30 a.m. And I thought I'm honored to be on this panel just discussing the work that we've all been doing. The study in Canada was called First in Family Experiences in a Canadian Medical School, a critically reflexive study. So thinking about the term critical reflexivity, that's basically intentionally shifting our research lens from the students onto some of the things that we're taking for granted in higher education. So one of the ways that we can engage in critical reflexivity is to make strange. So thinking about some of the things that we routinely do and don't think about in higher education. And for those of us who have been here for a long time, it's hard to kind of see those things that we take for granted that we're always doing. We accept them as normal and natural, but that might be limiting our efforts at widening participation, or keeping first and family students in programs like medicine where they may feel like they're the outsiders, as been highlighted by both Cara and Ja already.
Sarah, could you just press play from current slides so you make the slides bigger on the
Oh,
screen?
sorry.
Oh.
Sorry. Play from current slide. Whoops. Are you seeing the right things? Or are you seeing notes? You're seeing notes?
No, we're seeing both slides, the current slide and the next slide, but that's better. That's bigger. Yeah.
Oh, let me see if I swap displays, if that's any better.
That's it. That's it. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
So we've done critical reflexivity. Okay. So we asked the question, how do first and family medical students experience the medical school environment? Let me just make you guys smaller. And we talked to a group of students for whom our education practices might not seem normal and natural. So students who were first in their family to go to medical school. This is a group that may not possess the forms of capital that Cara was talking about. In the Canadian study, we decided we should also talk to a few students who were more likely to see education practices as normal and natural. So that's why we talked to a few medical students whose parents are doctors. And the research question was, how do first and family medical students experience the medical school environment? Similar to the other studies, we talked to self-identified first and family medical students. We talked about what first and family meant to them, their journey into the medical school, their experiences at medical school. And we asked the same questions of the students with MD parents, other than what does first and family mean to them. So thinking about belonging in medical school, first and family students perceived a dominant culture of medical students, and that they were the outsiders. So it felt very much like this is a group that's well gelled and we are outside of that group. And they'd sometimes receive some messaging that they didn't actually belong. So for example, I mentioned, I think, to a classmate once about my mom being in a union job. She's a factory worker. And my classmate was like, oh, your mom's in a union? That was like a foreign concept to them that they had read about, but didn't realize or didn't relate to them in their life or in their relationships. They didn't know people like that, which told me that they were coming from a completely different type of social class and community. Another student spoke about feeling like he was under a magnifying glass as one of the only Black students in his class. And students from the medical families didn't quite have the same experience. They all kind of felt at home with their new surroundings. They had friends back home that had similar career paths. So this student said, I guess I get to continue living the same way that I always have, like in terms of socioeconomic focus of it all. It's not like my lifestyle is going to substantially change at any point. I'm not going to have to go from growing up in a relatively well-off household to growing up in a middle-class sort of way. So for the first and family students, as was highlighted in the Australian and UK studies, the first and family students tended to have sort of a dual sense of not belonging. There was a dominant culture at medical school that they felt like they were outsiders from. And when they went back home, they had this change in status. So in Bourdieuian terms, there was a shift in their habitus, which made things a bit challenging. So in Canada, when medical students near the end of undergraduate education, they have to apply for residency. That's their specialty training or postgraduate training. First and family students brought this up as a key place where they felt like others were at an advantage given their cultural, social, and economic capital. So highlighting the forms of capital that Cara outlined. This participant spoke of her friend. She was telling me, oh yes, I'm with the head of the department at this hospital and this hospital. And I was thinking, oh my God, how do you even find out who that is? and then selectively book an elective with them. Another one, one of the medical families students said, I'm very comfortable emailing physicians with a question, or like, can I shadow you or meet with you? So just a very different approach, even if you do know that you have to do those things. Sometimes it was in the confidence to approach the doctors. And economic capital, like the other two studies, was a theme as well. That was something I was constantly worried about. How do I make enough money during the summer to make sure that things are okay-ish during the year? Other people are doing research and things, but they don't pay you basically anything. And finally, as part of the critical reflexivity piece, we wanted to think about the strengths and advantages that the first in family students actually do bring. It's not all about the challenges that they have based on the things that we're doing, but they bring advantages, as Cara outlined earlier. They definitely saw themselves as having resilience and having had experiences that other students may not have had that make them identify better with the patients. So this participant said, given my upbringing and my background, I think I can empathize a lot of our patients better who are struggling through similar situations, who are more so in poverty. I moved to Canada when I was 7 and I lived in a little closet, not a metaphor closet. I lived in a little closet for, I think, the first 5 to 6 years I was here, just because we couldn't afford a bigger place. Interview 2 said, I think it makes me more resilient, and that's really important because I kind of worry about some of my peers sometimes, because some of the people that I go to school with, I have to say, I don't think they've ever encountered any adversity. And then one of the Black participants said, I think Black patients appreciate my being there. The way they interact with me is just different. They tend to share more stuff, and I don't really think it was just in my head, and they feel a real sense of comfort. So I think it actually has been a strength for me. And just in conclusion, what does all of this mean for diversity, equity, and inclusion? There's a paper in academic medicine titled Diversity Isn't Enough, and our findings would support this assertion. It's not enough to get a more diverse body of students in. We also need to pay attention to their sense of inclusion and belonging. All of these studies shed some light on the subtle ways that first and family students might be excluded in the medical school. And keeping that critically reflexive lens can help us examine how we might be, we as the institutions might be inadvertently rewarding certain students who conform and reproduce the existing hierarchies rather than embracing and making room for the diverse perspectives that can really transform medical education and ultimately healthcare. We can also be critically reflexive when it comes to equity. We assume the more driven medical students are the ones that get the best experiences. They're engaging the high profile doctors and securing shadowing experiences, but this research suggests that that's not necessarily the case. It's those who are most comfortable and most aware in the dominant culture who have the foresight and confidence to make these connections, and they are then rewarded for their perceived motivation. So uncovering all of these unwritten rules about approaching faculty and shadowing and research opportunities, unstated expectations of unpaid labor that result in reference letters that help garner further experiences. So if we can keep uncovering how these taken for granted norms advantage some students and disadvantage others, then we can hopefully keep working to making a more inclusive student body for everyone. So I will figure out how to stop sharing everything.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, it's been interesting to hear about the kind of resonances between the projects across the 3 countries so far. So Cara's now going to talk to us a little bit about the work we've been doing together this year in the follow-up study in Australia. Thanks, Cara.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Steve. So yeah, I think there's some really clear overlaps between the 3 studies, which kind of show how entrenched I guess the culture of medical schools is, as well as some of these broader patterns of social inequality. So can medical students from different backgrounds make a difference as doctors, or how can they? And this is the next piece of the puzzle that we're trying to understand. So what I'm going to present now are some preliminary findings from follow-up interviews that we have just finished conducting with our original Australian cohort. So in 2014, all of our participants gave permission to be recontacted, and our first round of follow-up interviews has just taken place this year at the 10-year mark. So we had 22, as I said, in our original cohort. We were able to definitely reach 21 of those this year, and 15 were available and happy to be interviewed again. So this is a quick overview of our participants and the specialties that they've gone into. So 5 are GPs, 3 are psychiatrists, 1 was working as a hospital physician, but not on a training pathway. 1 was working for a pharmaceutical company, and the rest are in a mix of medical and surgical specialties. So the one that stands out a bit here is psychiatry. So 20% of our sample are psychiatrists, which only make up 5% of doctors. So together as well, more than half of our sample are either in general practice or psychiatry. And other research has found that doctors from low SES backgrounds are more likely to choose those 2 specialties specifically, both of which are sort of relatively socially orientated, or that's how they seem. So we re-interviewed these 15 people to find out how their careers, relationships, and identities have developed over the past 10 years. And we're still really in the process of analysing the data. So what I'm presenting tonight is a bit of a sneak preview of some of our emerging findings, particularly around cultural capital. And I'm just going to show a few snapshots of different participants and what they say now, particularly about fitting into the profession and how they relate to patients. So coming back firstly to Samantha, who said in 2014 that she expected she would be herself with patients, but might have to behave differently around doctors. She's now a GP, and she's found that the distance between the personal and the professional isn't as big as she expected. So she says, I feel like I've probably matured quite a bit, so the chasm between the 2 isn't as obvious. I'm probably a bit more relaxed in my doctor life than I expected, and a little bit more mature in my personal life. I do obviously still have to keep tabs on myself at work and make sure that I'm appropriate and not swearing and things like that, but I don't swear as much in my personal life anymore either. So this kind of convergence between identities that Samantha describes could be a sign that her habitus has changed and her personal dispositions have adapted to align more closely with the culture of medicine. But what Samantha's experience seems to suggest is that she's actually found a space in medicine where her habitus is not out of place. So she also said that in relation to being a doctor, I've got really bad imposter syndrome. But she said, I think I fit okay into general practice because there's such a wide variety of people doing GP. Like there's some really bogan GPs out there. So I feel like I'm not a bogan GP, but I'm definitely not an upper class type of GP. So I think I fit into that world okay. And a bogan, for our international audience, is a term that describes a white working class identity. It's usually used in a derogatory way, although it can be a bit more playful, somewhat akin to the British term chav. So Samantha is not necessarily comfortable within the medical profession as a whole, and feeling like an imposter was a really strong theme across our interviews in 2014 and in 2024. But Samantha has found a niche in medicine where there's enough diversity that she feels that she does fit. And our participants have largely gravitated towards working in areas where they feel that they fit in. So whether that's in relation to the specialty they've chosen, the geographic area, or the patient groups that they're dealing with. So this is the case for Liam, who as a student in 2014 was adamant that whatever he ended up doing, he would be focusing on disadvantaged populations. He's now a psychiatrist, and he's chosen to work in a disadvantaged area of a big city, which is not where he grew up, but it's of a similar kind of socioeconomic status. And he says, I actually just prefer sort of working where I can at least make sense of helping people who need and deserve the help a little bit more. I think I would feel it in my bones, like something was wrong if I was working in the wealthy area of the city. It wouldn't sit comfortably. So Liam's remained very consistent in his preferences over the past decade. And he alludes here to these preferences actually being embodied. So it would feel wrong to him to be working in a wealthy suburb. And he went on later to describe actually having an aversion to these kinds of areas. And this fits very much with the idea of habitus, which is always embodied. In terms of fitting into the profession, similarly to Samantha, Liam feels comfortable around some of his colleagues, but he says not the crowd who want to go straight into private practice and want to just work in the wealthy areas. And you can end up talking a really different language about mental health there, because when I'm talking about mental health, I'm talking about trauma and disadvantage for children whose dad went to jail for domestic violence that they witnessed. And some colleagues are talking about just a whole different world, I guess. It feels like sometimes you just don't really have much to relate to. So this is interesting, I think, because Liam's not just talking about fitting into the profession himself, but that he finds it hard to connect with some other psychiatrists in relation to the content of the work itself. So sort of suggesting that doctors from different backgrounds may end up thinking about health differently. Another example comes from Nick, who spoke in 2014 about understanding where patients were coming from. So Nick's also now a psychiatrist, and he still feels less distant to patients than he sees some other doctors being. So again, very consistent between his outlook over the 10 years. And he describes how other doctors from the leafy suburbs, as he put it, might be on a ward round and they're thinking about the medicine. They're completely ignoring the fact that this person doesn't have family support. They're ignoring the fact that this person is facing accommodation instability. They're not paying attention to the fact that they're about to write a script for a non-PBS medication, meaning a non-subsidized medicine, which clinically would be a great drug, but is never going to happen for this patient because they can't afford it. And what Nick and a number of our participants described is when other doctors leave the room, they're the ones who stay behind and are engaging with the patient, answering their questions and trying to address some of these problems. And I want to come back again to Fiona. So Fiona's the one whose mum had been a drug user and had been to jail. And then as a medical student, when her class was told they didn't know about these issues, she said she just bit her tongue. So Fiona's now working in emergency, and she told us how she draws on her lived experience to make connections with patients and empathize with them. So she says, I can understand where these people are coming from. They walk in the door, I say, okay, you're an addict. And I can very quickly make that connection. And often they'll start talking to me because they come in thinking, oh, you're just a snooty doctor, I don't want to talk to you. But if I can say something that they go, oh, hang on, maybe you do get it, then they talk. And Fiona gave us examples of times when she has directly shared her own experiences with patients, actually saying, look, my mum was an alcoholic. And by doing that, she's been able to resolve a few situations in the emergency room when other doctors haven't been able to get the patient to talk to them. So in medical school, Fiona's lived experience wasn't recognised or revealed, but in clinical practice, she's finding it is a resource. It's actually a form of cultural capital that's recognised by patients. So many of our participants are really driven by wanting to address disadvantage, and they do draw on their own experiences and knowledge to do this. But there are also some downsides for them as doctors practicing in this way. So another participant, Anita, has returned to her home area to work as a GP, where she says it's good because the patients find her relatable and easy to talk to. But she goes on, it's bad as well because she's spending more time listening to patients, treating more complex issues, but only getting the same remuneration for each appointment. So by being empathetic, trying to address the bigger picture of health and its social determinants through her practice, she's penalised financially. And working in general practice, she's also going to be earning less than the ones who've gone into some of the other specialties, surgery, anaesthetics, and so on. So we can see that there are potential inequities built into the way healthcare is funded that disadvantage the doctors who focus on addressing disadvantage in their own clinical practice. So this is something we need to look into a lot more, but coming back to the original premise of widening participation in medicine, one goal, as I said, is to increase access to medicine as a career, so as a point of social justice, a route to social mobility. And that first goal is really aimed at the medical students and doctors. And then the other is to improve patient outcomes by decreasing the social distance between doctor and patient. So on that second point, our participants say their backgrounds do help them as doctors to communicate with patients, to understand the social context of health. But in relation to the first goal of social mobility and social justice, spending time listening to patients, working in disadvantaged communities does seem to come with some disadvantages for doctors in terms of earning potential and therefore social mobility. So the two goals of widening participation may actually be in tension with one another to a certain extent. And I think it will be important to see how this plays out over time, most of our participants talked about cost of living pressures, also the aspirations that they now have for their own children. So there's a range of factors that might impact on where and how they practice as doctors in the future. But we're still analysing this batch of interviews. And I do want to also acknowledge and thank all our participants who've been really generous with their time. And we hope to follow everyone up again in 2034. And we also hope that all this work across the 3 countries feeds back into the conversation about widening participation in medicine and offers some new perspectives for medical educators and the profession. So I'm going to hand over now to Parker from the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, who's going to say a little bit more about how insights from these kind of social science studies can hopefully be applied in medicine and medical training. So thanks, Parker.
And thanks, Cara and Steve and everyone for asking me to to talk today. I find this work fascinating, and my craft background is as a GP, and my current research is largely in the area of GP vocational training. And an important issue there is that in Australia, the structure of GP vocational training is almost as much around workforce issues as it is around education. And that workforce is especially directed towards the need for more GPs in rural areas. So that's some context. And I'm really taken by the findings that have been reported, especially in the Australian study around the different areas of practice where these people choose to practice, and this idea that lower SES areas are a whole different world, and the issues of fitting in, and that's both for the doctor feeling more comfortable in that setting that they're used to, and also finding that the patient's related much better to them because of that connection, that shared background. And the other sort of issue of I think the psychiatrist who didn't feel comfortable around his colleagues who came from more privileged backgrounds and wanted to work in higher SES areas. And I think a really important thing that something that certainly another thing that I have seen is the issue of people wanting to give back to those, either to give back to the communities explicitly, or just feeling that they wanted to work somewhere where they could, as one guy said, preferred working where that at least makes sense of helping people. So recognising the need, but sometimes wanting to give back. So that brings me to, what do I think the implications of all this are for general practice and in my context, especially for GP training, but also perhaps for medical practice more generally. But I think, again, the social justice and social mobility side of things is not what I'm as directly interested in, or I think a lot of people in general practice would be as interested in. But it, again, like Cara, I think it feeds into that whole issue of it's not a dichotomy of those two things, that the safe and accessible healthcare, that is an issue in it. And the safe and accessible healthcare is, this is really, really strong evidence for the need to, if we are going to reduce the morbidity, mortality, inequality between lower SES and higher SES areas, then one of the things we really need to think about is addressing the kind of people who we have in medicine. And this is an issue that's been addressed previously. I don't want to draw too many parallels with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sort of health. That's a much more even more complex area. But again, I think the University of Newcastle has done wonderful work in actually admitting to their medicine program and graduating a large number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health practitioners who have made a difference to their communities. But again, that's probably just even too complex and not really a good case study. Perhaps it's better to look at the very considerable efforts that have been made in trying to encourage students of rural background to be admitted to medical schools, because there's very good evidence if you come from a rural background, you're much more likely to practice rurally, which is where the most obvious health workforce needs are. But I think a similar thing applies for students from lower socioeconomic status areas. It's not quite as obvious as the rural inequality divide, but it's very much there similarly. And certainly the evidence that we have from our studies in GP vocational training are that it's not a zero-sum game, that that placing people in rural and lower SES areas and out of metropolitan areas is not just addressing immediate workforce issues, it's actually a richer training environment. But the issue remains that you can take registrars and have them work in those areas, but they don't stay there. And I think we don't have evidence for low SES students, but we certainly do for rural students, that if you want to do that, you've got to take students who come from rural backgrounds. So I think that's a big lesson for us here in GP training and medicine more broadly, that we need to think about what other ways we can address, as we have with rural students, of having more lower SES background students accepted into medical schools. I think that's a big lesson for us. So thanks again for asking me to talk about that.
Thanks, Parker. So we're getting to the end of the hour, but we do have a Zoom book for a little while longer. So does anyone in the audience today have any questions for our panelists, or a general question that anyone could address related to the research? If you want to, yeah. Yeah, Mary, yeah.
Oh, hi. I take care of the year one students at the University of Newcastle, and I frequently feel ethically conflicted in my job, because I am aware of the fact that our course is set up for students with, lots of advantages and financial support to be successful, and not set up for people that have complicated lives to be successful. And I'm also aware a lot of all the things you talked about, Cara, them feeling like outsiders. But I'm always flat chat, just running the course. And I'd love to hear somebody's perspective on how I can help them feel more included, given that I can't change necessarily the behavior of the other students.
I mean, I can talk about that a little bit, I suppose, just generally about teaching in a university, is that I think there's similar parallel imbalances that happen across courses that are maybe a little bit more extreme in something like medicine. From my point of view, I'm constantly surprised how can I put this? How, say, just how kind of course coordinators kind of are very strict about things like extensions and stuff like that. I'm like, in my courses, I'm very open about like letting students have more time and all that kind of thing. Like, I think one thing we can all do in terms of the way that we run our courses is to be really open to their lives and allow kind of some leeway there. And like, some of the responses when I say that to some of my colleagues is it's being unequal, like you're not being equitable to the students. But like, if it's already unequal and you're helping students, like it's a kind of, bit of a catch-22, I suppose. So that's something certainly that I do in my broader courses, but I'd be interested to hear from the other medical educators about what they would think. Yeah.
I mean, I'll just add, I suppose, that in terms of making people feel more included, I suppose part of it is just recognizing that there is diversity in the medical school, even though there isn't enough, there is some there. And sort of the comments that one of our participants said about kind of, oh no, none of you will understand this because you're all privileged. There's kind of an othering that potentially occurs even for those who have made it into medical school. So I suppose, yeah, maybe just making PBL tutors and staff more aware of, that there are potentially students with a range of backgrounds. I'm not sure whether, we're not going to be encouraging people necessarily to have to talk about themselves in their own classes, but yeah, just recognizing that there might be a range of backgrounds that people are bringing to medical school in the first place, because students have been surprised about that themselves. When they go there, they find it's actually more diverse than the stereotype, even though, yeah, it's still not diverse enough.
If I can share a bit of experiences, my experience from King's College London, not sure whether entirely applicable to the Australian context. So here at King's, we talk about the term psychological safety a lot. So basically, when we have students who acknowledge that everyone's from different backgrounds, and it's really important for us to have this safe learning environment. So I guess that's kind of very important for any type of teaching environment, with everyone got different experience. And also like to mention that it's something we keep trying to do, like always, like a lot of room to improvement is really signposting. So either from the university level, from the school level, or from like the module block level to signpost, this is an inclusive environment. And also in settings, discuss the medical curriculum content sometimes can be reflect more like traditional mainstream backgrounds. And that's why in my presentation, I mentioned about the decolonization, for example, at King's, a lot of the initiatives are actually initiated by students saying that they feel like their curriculum are not entirely reflective of their learning needs. So there's been kind of student groups to have opportunities of saying that there's a chance I can have a bit of a say in my own curriculum. So I thought that's probably something that we can try and see with the work.
Yep. And there's a comment here from Chris Johnson. Patient partners in Canada have been actively pushing for patient involvement in medical school curricula and cultural change, which I think would support first and family students, but it's been met with tokenism by schools thus far. I'm wondering if there have been similar trends in Australia or UK, or have they had more success? So, Cara,
Can I ask what patient involvement in curriculum? I'm not sure what they mean by that.
In Australia, it'd be called the lived experience framework.
Is Chris still here? Do you want to expand on your question a little bit there, Chris? If you can.
I've seen Michael's made a similar comment that he's got experience of patient representation coming into the medical curriculum, being representing a narrow group of types of patients. So I suppose, yeah, maybe this relates to sort of simulated patients and patients coming in to share their experiences in the curriculum, and maybe that a broader range of patients being brought in. So then students could kind of demonstrate, I suppose, some of that empathy and understanding they have.
So Chris says here, engaging patients as partners in revising curricula and as mentors for students. Yeah, that's what she meant by that. Yeah.
Yeah, I have had in my mind to revise our communication skills curriculum to have it be taught by our simulated patients that are, have a lot of patient experience rather than by the tutors.
Yep.
Of course, it would be hard to engage a diverse range of patients to do that as well. We'd have the same challenges, I guess.
I was just going to add that it can be very challenging, especially in a medical expert dominant curriculum, to embed some of these approaches, just because sometimes it does feel tokenistic, or it can be almost harmful to the patient partners that you might bring in if they're not properly supported. or if they're just being plunked into something where we see medical expertise as the goal and not fully honoring some of the experiential expertise. So Mary Jane, with your question, I was going to say as well, like trying to think about how you could move away from the teacher as expert and opening it up to, some of the students will be experts in some of these areas. Really setting that out at the beginning of the year, that everyone is an expert in some area, not just the teacher being the expert all the time and the students being the passive recipients of knowledge. But yes, I have a paper that speaks to some of the challenges, saying that it's very worth doing, trying to do some of these things, but there are pitfalls that we can try to avoid as we continue to research and learn.
I have a comment from Jem here. Thanks for the excellent presentations. I'm current researching medical education about inclusion, healthcare of undeserved patients. There seems to be a link between WP background and wanting to work in a low SES area, as discussed, but that also seems potentially problematic. I would be interested in your further views on this. Does anyone on the panel want to address that?
Well, I think it goes to that tension between the two key goals of widening participation that I touched on, and Parker sort of raised that as well, that, on the face of it, the social justice, social mobility for doctors seems like the minor worry, because that's such a tiny fraction, if we're talking about social change, a tiny fraction of the population, but it's actually linked very much to the second point about improving healthcare outcomes. So if those inequalities, if the improving patient health comes at the cost of, widening participation backgrounds, doctors having to work and having to stay in sort of low SES areas, that is problematic. So yeah, I'm not sure how we address that, but I think basically, yeah, doctors working in disadvantaged areas should be paid more and help to to experience those same kind of career advantages and satisfaction. Parker, let's got your hand up.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and certainly if you're a GP, the way remuneration is structured, or even especially if you're taking care of complex, multi-morbid patients with a whole lot of social and complex issues beyond their greater physical morbidity, you're very poorly recompensed. So yeah, that there's, while I'm saying we need to attract more people from lower SES backgrounds to be able to best serve those underserved populations, an issue that has to also be addressed is making it attractive enough to work in those situations to keep those people there. You might argue that people who have a whole lot less economic sort of background to fall back on, it's more difficult to go and work in those poorer paid places. So you don't want to get yourself into a catch-22.
Yeah, a couple of people that I interviewed said that they started bulk billing, wanted to bulk bill, but it just was completely non-financial. They were struggling to meet their cost of living. So they were then, therefore, couldn't do it. Yeah.
Yeah. One of our participants made a comment that she's realized, she thought all doctors were rich, but she's realized now there's the rich and the not so rich doctors, and she is in that second group. And so it is starting to rankle a little bit for some of our participants. And so that's what I mean by this, the social mobility issue is a problem if some people decide I've had enough and I can't keep doing this work and I'm going to move to a different area, or I'm not going to, I'm going to have to bill patients more and raise the costs and not spend as much time with them. Yeah,
and I think in the past that's always been a very relative thing. It's, do you want to be rich, or do you sincerely want to be rich? And you could still be very well off adopting a very, adopting a practice that didn't prioritise money. But in general practice, the last 10 years have seen such an erosion of the way it's everything's paid that it's possible to be poorly paid and be a GP. You have to work hard to do that by really taking care of a more difficult, problematic population of patients. But it's possible now, where in the past even you could do that and still sort of make reasonable money. But things are becoming tighter.
And
Yeah, that came out
without putting you on the spot here, Parker, and knowing that you're not responsible for any of the funding, what are the chances of this kind of stuff improving in the future in terms of funding models and those kind of structures?
I'm certainly not the person to ask, and I think realistically, it's unlikely to change very much at all quickly. So I think it's in general practice, at least, I think it's a sort of bit of an entrenched problem.
Because I imagine it's a hard thing to get the public on board for, because the public thinks that doctors are rich.
Yeah.
So
well, that they may not think. Well, a lot of them may not think they're rich, but they certainly think they're quite well off and can't understand why some very ethical practices are having to say, sorry, we can't bulk bill you.
Yeah.
That's very difficult for patients to understand.
Definitely.
Which is fair enough.
I see Sarah's put her paper in the chat there if anyone wants to download it for what we were discussing before. Yeah, do we have any other questions or discussion points before we wrap up? No? Okay. Well, we might leave it there. So I want to thank all our participants today. I imagine in the future, as Cara and I, and as at the other locations, they do their follow-up projects, that we'll be doing more events and hopefully putting a report and some publications together out of the stuff. So please look out for that in the future. And thanks for everyone for coming.
Thanks, everyone.